And this is the 1/35th scale Italeri LAV-25AD.
And déjà vu.
Have we not met before, monsieur?
I don't think so.
Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with this model showcase video for this 1/35th scale LAV-25AD. And just like what the pre-video intro hinted to, this is not the first time one of these models have come across this desk. A little while ago, I went ahead and did a double feature model showcase video for two of these exact same models. However, the difference between this one and the other one is that those two were built for my own personal collection and are not for sale and or purchase. This one, however, was built for private commission. An individual saw that video, he liked the model so much that he went ahead and hired me to build one to the condition that you see it here. As I often mention in these build videos, I often take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. This model here is built predominantly out of the box. However, on this one here, I ran into an issue with the suspension, which I will be touching upon it as the video goes in. Along with that, we are also going to do a brief review of the basic starter kit in this video. So stay tuned because there's going to be a bunch of content coming right at you. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the LAV-25AD. The LAV-25AD was an air defense system that was designed for the U.S. Marine Corps and was based off of the chassis from the LAV-25 light armored car. Of course, the LAV-25 itself is a family of light armored cars that was designed in the late 70s and entered into service and in production during the 1980s timeframe. This pattern vehicle is mostly exclusively used by the U.S. Marine Corps. This vehicle has proven to be a very adaptable and successful little design. The vehicle is fully enclosed with very good armor protection. The vehicle also has some really good speeds and is very maneuverable because of its 8-wheel all-wheel drive design. The vehicle is also fully amphibious, which was one of the reasons why the U.S. Marine Corps particularly really enjoyed this little design and why they adopted it. This design is also very adaptable and can be configured in a multitude of different roles. Such examples would include the standard LAV-25, which utilizes a 25mm chain gun contained in a fully revolving turret, a mortar variant, and specifically for this video here, the air defense version. Now, like I stated in the last LAV-25AD video, when it came time for finding research material or any information on this subject, my resources were pretty much slim to none. Basically, what I was able to find out was that this vehicle was designed in the 1990s timeframe and entered service shortly thereafter, specifically with mostly the U.S. Marine Corps. For the armament, the vehicle utilized 2 pods containing 4 Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, and in the center was a Vulcan-type cannon. And that was basically it. After that, there was not really a whole lot of information out there. Well, fortunately, since that last video, I've had some feedback from both viewers on the channel, and by the way, thank you for all that information, and also from the commissioner himself, who served on one of these vehicles in his Marine Corps service. These vehicles were primarily utilized and kept for FOB defense, even though the threat of enemy air attack wasn't exactly something that was a regular occurrence. Although originally designed for air defense, because of the 25mm Gatling gun in combination with the infrared FLIR system, the vehicle proved to be very effective for ground defense. Another attribute that was also appreciated about the FLIR system was the fact that it was able to see potential threats at further distances compared to some other systems. I was told that the range of the FLIR system was about 5 kilometers, which was a fantastic advantage in order to identify potential threats. Upon the conclusion of the war in Iraq, the LAV-25ADs were sent back to the U.S. where they have been mothballed. Some of the issues that this pattern vehicle has is, number one, complexity and also cost. The alternative would be the Humvee air defense system, which basically has the same firepower as the LAV-25AD, but since it's mated on the Humvee, the operation costs are far lower. And here's the model at the start of the video. For this build here, just like with the last two, I'm utilizing the same Italeri 1/35 scale LAV-25AD, or more specifically for this particular kit here, the LAV-25ADV. Just like I mentioned in the last video, the Italeri LAV-25 really dates back to the early 1990s, probably around 1991 or so. Right after the release of the original LAV-25 kit, Italeri went ahead and had this universal chassis, and so they decided to tool up several different variants of this exact same vehicle in order to offer this kit in different guises. Over the years, they've done the anti-tank version with the tow missile system, the standard LAV-25 with the 25mm Bushmaster, the mortar variant, and this version here, which is the AD. The AD kit was released by Italeri originally in 1993, and this here is the original release of that kit. In the last video, the kit itself, although the internal components are exactly the same, the release was a later reissue. This one here is with the original box art and with the original graphic design compared to the other one from the other video, which utilized the same box art, but the graphic design as well as some of the other information was slightly different compared to this version that we have here. Just like with the other LAV-25 from Italeri, this kit here is all comprising of exclusively injection molded plastic parts. There are no things like rubber or photo etch, which is something that you'll see on more modern contemporary releases. Also, these kits here are still pretty easily come by. This one here was acquired off of eBay, and they run anywhere between about 25 to about 40 US dollars, as well as anywhere else in between. The availability is pretty good. If you just type this particular kit in the eBay search, you should get several listings available at any given time, so tracking one down is not very difficult. Not to mention, of course, if you want to snag one at a model show, this is the type of kit that you might be able to bump into. Not to mention, you might see one at a flea market, swap meet, and if you're really lucky, you might even encounter one at your local hobby shop, granted if they have a nice little stash of kits that are tucked away in the corner. Starting with the model's box art and graphic design, like I stated before, this one here utilizes the same illustration found on the later re-released. However, it's slightly different. Here I have, in comparison, the later re-released version. Note that the scale of the illustration is slightly different. The one on the later re-release, the scale was a little bit smaller, and this was due to the change in graphic design that we have here on the remainder of the box art composition. The color is also slightly different. Notice this one here is a little bit more orange in color compared to the more tannish hue found on the older release, but that's really just nitpicking. By and large, the illustrations are exactly the same. The quality of the illustration is pretty good. Italeri utilizes artists quite frequently during the 1990s timeframe, and his illustrations have the same look and feel to them, and by and large are decently rendered. Carrying on from the main box art takes to the typography. Just like with the other Italeri kits of this period, this kit has this italicized sans serif typeface with the drop shadow. This typeface was used on all of the Italeri kits of this era, and the only thing that differs is sometimes the main color. Generally, it's in this red format that we see here, but I've also seen it in yellow, green, as well as blue. This just mainly depends on the colors used on the main box art. However, red seems to be the most common. From the title, it takes to the Italeri logo. It's in this blue square, as well as the other useful information that we see here directly below, namely indicating that it's a 1/35 scale plastic model kit. The kit number is 274, and even with the re-releases, the kit number stayed exactly the same. So if you're looking for an Italeri LAV-25AD, kit number 274 is the one to look for. Moving along, takes to the side tabs. Here we have the Italeri logo again, kit number, as well as a nice little blurb of the vehicle in question. And what's cool is Italeri has the same information but translated in all the different languages that we see here on the side of the box. On the corner sections, we have a nice little cropped version of the box art with the same information that I mentioned before. This type of format, again, was typical on Italeri kits of this era. On the other tab, we have some more of the information in small little blurbs, as well as the remainder of the corporate info. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and crack the box open. Now, this is one thing that's a bit different from the last time I built one of these kits, or two of these kits for that matter, and that was because by the time I was able to get the video into editing, all the information and scenes that were filmed with the unboxing were lost. But fortunately for this one here, that's not going to be the case, or at least knock on wood, that is. Like I stated before, all of the components are made from injection molded polystyrene. On this kit here, the styrene is in this dark yellow type coloring. However, I will say this, on the re-release versions, the coloring was more of a pumpkin orange color in comparison, but the quality of the moldings and the details themselves are identical to the ones that you see here. Starting with the first runner takes us to the turret. The turret itself does have some interior detailing, very minimalistic interior detailing, but interior detailing nonetheless. You can see all of the pieces are integrally molded into the bottom pane over here, which would include some seats, as well as some control panels. The top of the turret has no interior detailing whatsoever. And the remainder of the detailing is all strewn out here on the runner. Like I stated before, all of the turret components are found on this single runner that we have here. And this is basically the runner that separates this version of the LAV-25 compared to the other releases done by Italeri. Looking over the runner, you can see some more of the Vulcan parts, namely the barrel segments, the barrel alignment rings, as well as the receiver and the feeder delinker system. This is probably one of the more delicate aspects of this kit, aside from the suspension, which I'll touch upon in a moment. The barrels and all the components are individually molded, which means you have to clean them off or remove them from the sprue, deburr them, and then get them assembled. Because of this, a beginner might have some problems with this because of the fine nature of these parts. However, because of the way they are molded and assembled, it does leave for a very nicely detailed and realistic piece. So it's one of those things that you do have to take your time with, but if you do it properly, it will yield for some really good results. Continuing on takes us to the antenna bases. Note on this kit over here, the antenna wires are integrally molded to the spring antenna base. This is something that I always found to be very problematic on plastic tank model kits, and it's something that I'm probably going to be snipping away and replacing with something made out of a real metal wire. But I'll touch upon that later as the video progresses. While on the same runner, you can see the Stinger missile pods as well as the detailing that's found on them. Hopefully it comes out in the light here, but the pods do have their spot weld details that are present, and they are nicely rendered on the plastic parts. Once everything is fully painted and assembled, they do shine pretty well. Also on that note, you can see the Stinger missile rack found in this section over here, as well as the details that are present on the moldings. The rack does have all of the units integrally molded in, which is something that you're going to have to take some care with when it comes time for painting them. But again, this is something I'll touch upon as the video progresses. Carrying on takes us to this runner here. Like I stated before, the remainder of the runners are going to be universal on all of the Italeri LAV-25 kits. This one here specifically consists of the components for the lower hull as well as the suspension. The lower hull does have some pretty nice details on it. The moldings are nice and crisp. And with the remainder of the parts, you get to see how they're spread out. Here we have the small little shock absorbers, the rudders, tow hitch, some swing arm details. This one here appears to be broken, but that's something I could easily take care of. Also, I know some of the parts are popped off of the runner. This is, again, something that you typically find when you purchase a kit secondhand like this one is. However, I went ahead and reviewed the kit contents prior to filming this video, and I was able to track down all the components necessary to build this model. Anyway, continuing on with the parts, here we have the rear wall, as well as the rear doors. Like I stated before, one advantage that the Italeri kit has over the older Eschi kit is that the Italeri one does have separate molded on doors. And because of that, you can actually model this vehicle in the closed or open state, depending on the usage that you're intending for this build for. We also have a ton of jerry cans that are supplied with this model. The jerry cans themselves are decently rendered. These are the same mounted jerry cans that are seen on several other Italeri kits, and again, they are pretty good for what they are. They assemble pretty well and have some pretty good detailing on them once they're fully painted and weathered. I also don't think I'm going to be utilizing all of the jerry cans that are supplied on this runner on this kit. This is due to the pattern of vehicle that this one is. You will have, I believe, a few of these left over. But again, we'll see as the video goes on. Here you can see the remainder of the parts and note how intricately and small they are rendered. This is something that you definitely have to pay attention to. Note all the little tie-down points that are found in this row, as well as the other components required to assemble the brush guards. These pieces are very finely molded and can very easily be lost or fling off to Lost Party. And if they do, you're going to be in trouble because you only have enough supplied to outfit the one vehicle. So there are no spares. If you screw up and lose one or two, you're basically going to be on the hook to fabricate some new ones. So pay attention to this when you're working on these. The handles are also molded in, and they are, again, decent for what they are. You can replace them with metal wires if worse comes to worse, but, you know, we'll see again as the build churns on. This runner here consists of the remainder of the hull parts, namely the upper hull segment, as well as the last of the suspension components, and most importantly, the wheels, which you obviously get quite a bit of. This model here is all made from injection polystyrene, as one can clearly see, and this is something that is a little bit different compared to some of the more newer releases that have made it to the market in recent years, namely like the release from Trumpeter. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that that kit utilizes rubber parts for the road wheels on this vehicle. For this one here, it's more of an older school type format where you have two sections, you gotta glue them together. However, once the wheels are assembled, painted, and weathered accordingly, they are more than capable of the job at hand. Here you can see some of the hubcap detailing, the hatch, the propeller drive shaft components, and also some of the parts here for the bottom suspension. Note that on this kit here, it is a single unit and just drops directly into place, which really does streamline the build quite a bit. On the upper hull, you can see all of the integrally molded in parts, as well as all these little indication points on mounting details. Most of these parts are actually going to be polished away with some sandpaper because, again, this is a universal component, and Italeri has these indication points molded in for other versions of the LAV-25 family. So for this one here, some of these indication points are not necessary, and you are going to have to remove them. This, by the way, is a common feature found on a lot of Italeri kits out there, and it's one that you have to factor in when doing one of their builds. If you see some indication points and they're not utilized, it's not supposed to be there on the real vehicle. So it's just for you to polish away with some sandpaper, and then you only use the indication points that are really necessary for your build. Keep that in mind. A lot of people seem to forget that. The remainder of the upper hull detailing has some nice little weld beads that are present, and you can also see the detailing here found on the main grille work. Outside of some of the other loose bits that are in this box, the next and final runner is this one that we have here, which consists of clear plastic components. Obviously, this runner here is for the turret, which utilizes some ballistic glass found on the front and side portions of the turret, and they are decently rendered on this vehicle. Note on the side windows here, they have some riveting detailing that is present. And on the main front window, and the other one is, by the way, in the box, but it's a mirror image piece, you not only have the same frame rivet detailing that are found on the side sections, but you also have the windshield wiper detailing integrally molded in. At the very bottom of the box, and just make sure there's nothing loose on the inside, here we have the instruction manual. The manual itself is your long format Italeri instruction sheet with the standard Italeri type illustrations found on the inside. I'm not sure if these are CAD drawings or if they're just old school drafted illustrations, but regardless of what they are, they should be more than suffice for the job at hand. In the past, I've had some pretty good results with these instructions. However, at times, depending on the kit, there are a small little mistake or misprint or two. However, for this one here, we'll see as the video goes on. On the last LAV-25s, I didn't run into this issue, but if this is something that was revised from this first pattern instruction sheet here, I'm of course going to point that out. And at the very bottom of the box, we have here a set of markings. Just like with all Italeri kits, this kit here supplies you with a set of water slide decals. The decals themselves appear to be good quality. They have your typical blue paper background, and although they are fairly old at this point, they appear to be in really good shape. So we'll see as the build progresses if these decals hold up or not. And here's the model during the construction point where I'm about to assemble the rear plate as well as the upper hull. Usually this goes by without any incident, and I could just progress to the build and all the way to completion. However, on this one here, I ran into an interesting debacle, and that involves the front swing arm system that we have here. Normally this goes by very quickly because the setup over here is one integral molding that just drops directly into place, and then you go ahead and connect the remainder of the details, fleshing out the detailing. Well, on this one I actually ran into a bit of a problem because when the piece went to line up, it was the holes, or I should say the tolerances, were a bit tight where the pegs were lining up, but some of the locations were a bit on the stiffer end. It wasn't really anything that caught my attention or anything. You know, I've experienced that before on many other builds. So I went ahead and installed everything, and I jigged everything into place with some small clamps just to make sure that the glue set and everything sets where it needs to be. Well, this went by without any problems, but after the glues were set, or when I thought they were set, I went to remove the clamps, and the entire section here was completely cracked and brittled, and just, it looked like an earthquake hit it. Sadly, I didn't get it on video. However, I did take a photograph or two of the situation at hand, and you can see it on the screen right now. Obviously, this is less than ideal and is something that needs to have been immediately addressed. I'm pretty sure several people out there watching this video, if this would have happened to them, the project probably would have been dead in the water at that point. This thing would have wound up in a spare parts bin, or even worse, a landfill. But for this one here, I decided to pressure on in. You know, I used some of my techniques to my advantage, and I'll be going over that in a moment. However, before I go ahead and elaborate on how I fixed it, let's go back to what caused the core problem, or what I believe caused the problem. Because there are a lot of these LAV-25 kits out there, and possibly this is something that you can run into. So it would behoove you to avoid this on your own personal builds. Keep in mind, I've already built 2 Italeri LAV-25 kits previous to this one here, so, you know, I was equally as stumped when I saw the problem happened. This could be a multitude of different problems. If I remember back to those other 2 builds, one of the units went together without any problems. However, the other one, I did encounter the similar situations that led to this one here, where the pieces did not really line up, or they did line up, but they were still a bit on the stiff side. And what I mean by stiff is that these little shock absorbers here that come from the bottom, they did line up with the holes, but it took a bit of bending in order to get the pieces to go into their corresponding locations. Because I encountered this issue on only one of the other builds at the time, this leads me to believe that I think there may be more than one of these molds that are in the Italeri factory where they used to create these kits, or these runners that we have here. On one of these molds, perhaps the specs might be slightly off on some of the parts, specifically on these items here in question. This is really the only thing I could think of why the piece would fit, but not fit on in a real efficient manner, while the other one went on without any problem. So this is probably something to watch out for. To add upon that, the other one, like I said, I just went ahead and clamped everything in place, the glue set, and they were good to go. This one, I used the same procedure, and then everything just cracked and brittled up on me. And this leads me to believe that because the plastic is older on this kit over here, this is probably what led to the breakage happening because of the older plastic. It may be slightly brittler compared to the newer production kits that I've touched upon in the other videos. So, that may all sound well and good, but you're probably wondering to yourself, well, John, you know, what do I do? How do I prevent this from happening? And really, your best bet is to modify some of the pegs and holes that are found on these pieces. You're going to instantly be able to tell if the piece is not fitting right. When you try to drop the component in place, you'll know, trust me. You'll try to position the piece in location. It's not going to fit. The holes aren't going to line up, or they're going to be slightly off, and you're going to encounter some resistance with getting everything where it needs to be. If this happens to you, don't try to muscle it into location, because, again, you could run into the problem that I encountered here. If this happens to you, what you need to do is you're going to need to remove some of the pegs that are found on some of the molded components, and possibly also drill out new locations for the piece to drop in. By doing this, this is basically going to have the parts settle into their appropriate locations in a way that is not going to put any stress on the component, and so the pieces will be able to be secured in place and held in place with the adhesives without any extra stress found on some of these frail plastic bits. This is probably your best way to prevent the situation that I encountered on this one here. So with all that out of the way, let me go ahead and describe the work that went into fixing this model that we have here. The first thing that I needed to have taken care of was the uneven surface found on the center spine. As we saw from the photograph, everything was all buckled, and it basically looked like a busted sidewalk. In order to fix it, I took a Dremel with a high-speed removal bit, and I went ahead and carefully milled down the top sections, making for a level surface, or as level of a surface as I can get. On the side portions here, these two were pretty chewed up, so I was able to refine them as much as I possibly could. Once the leveling was completed, I went ahead and tried to add some red putty to these sections in order to blend them into one smooth section. However, I found out that trying to get into here is actually deceivingly tricky. Although it may look pretty straightforward, trying to get in here with sandpaper as well as needle files is actually harder than it looks. I was able to accomplish this task, however, I wasn't positive that I was able to get the components sanded down to a seamless manner. So much so that I just went ahead and simply just plated up the entire section over here with some strips of thin sheet styrene. The sheet styrene doesn't add anything really to the overall thickness of the piece, and it makes for a nice smooth surface that you see here, and that will be more appreciated, of course, once the model is fully painted and weathered. After the sections were plated over, the next area of business was to remake the swing arm. See, the original swing arm didn't hold up after the buckling and repairing process. The piece was completely trashed. In order to repair it, I'm going to have needed to track down a duplicate section. Well, that's not really easy to do, so one advantage though that this kit does have is that this swing arm here is identical in these 4 locations. So I did have 3 possible donors to make the repair with. Luckily on this one over here, because of the way this side was just completely uneven and needed to have been plated over, I had to remove this swing arm entirely, and this became the donor to make the new mold. I went ahead and took this part, removed some of the fragile components like the steering clevis here and a few other smaller bits, but really just the steering clevis. Oh, and the drive shaft. With the naked A-frame, I was able to go ahead and make a mold of it. Once I had the mold on hand, I was able to make a resin casting, and that's the component that we see here. The resin casting is a complete duplicate from the plastic master, and because of that, it dropped directly into its appropriate location with no other mods being necessary. So with the repair out of the way, I could continue with the remainder of the build, you know, as intended. This would include the mounting of the rear plate as well as the top deck. The remainder of the parts should go on, knock on wood, without any problems. But one thing I do want to mention at this point here are the 2 injection pin marks that are found right here on the bow. These injection pin marks are really small, however, they do emerge slightly from the surface. So much so that when it comes time for mounting on the top section, this can throw off the fit of the model. Not by a whole lot, but you are going to have a slight seam found in this section over here, or I should say more of a seam compared to if these 2 sections are removed. It could be easily plugged up with some super glue or some putty, but require a little bit more extra sanding compared to just deleting these sections at this point in the build. To do that, you could use simple sandpaper, just polish it down, or even just a needle file. Whatever you need to do, just make sure these 2 sections are removed and the build will go by much easier. With the model fully completed, you get to see what the suspension looks like with the remainder of the equipment now mounted. Also, with the model fully completed, you get to see how all of the repair work just blends in effortlessly with the remainder of the details. This would include the center spine revisions as well as just the components that were needed to assemble the cluster that I touched upon before. With the model back right side up, we can continue with going over some of the areas. Now again, a lot of this is going to be repetitive, so I'm going to try to go over it as fast as possible. On the lower portion here of this kit, there are a lot of little toe points and hookup points that need to be mounted on. These pieces are very small and they are also very easily lost. Unfortunately, the kit does not give you any spares, so if you lose one, you're basically going to be scratch building some new ones. Fortunately for this model here, that wasn't an issue, and I was able to fully assemble it with the kit supply parts without any problems. But again, this is another aspect of these LAV-25 kit builds that you really need to stay on the ball with. This is true for not just those hookups that I touched upon before, but also for the brush guards. The brush guards on this kit here are each made out of 3 pieces. You have the main guard itself, and then it has 2 small support arms. These pieces are molded separately, so you have to assemble each of them on the model. Again, this is doable, but you have to take your time, and you have to have a lot of patience with this. A good set of tweezers is also something that goes a long way. But again, it's one of those parts where if it flings off the lost part of you, yeah, you're going to be mad. Moving along takes us to one of the differences that are found on this build as opposed to the other 2 renditions of this vehicle that I touched upon in the other video, and that involves the 2 jerry cans found on the back. The kit does supply you with enough components to assemble 3 of these units, and the components themselves are actually really nicely detailed. They assemble into a mounted jerry can, which means you have the jerry can itself with the nylon strap and also the little holder, which would be affixed to the vehicle. All of these details are nicely rendered, like for instance the handles and the gas cap itself are separate and are not integrally molded on, which is something that you will see on some other older kits that are out there. For mounting them to the vehicle, this is something you have a lot of flexibility with. The kit isn't really clear on how they go on, and it's basically up to your discretion. I went ahead and asked the commissioner if he wanted these components found on the vehicle. He gave me the okay, so they were simply just installed to the way you see it here. When it comes to painting them, of course you want to paint them in a format which has all the components appropriately painted. What I mean by that is on the bottom portion here, which is the holder, like I touched upon before, this is actually secured to the vehicle. So because of that, you want to use the same paints and weathering that's found on the remainder of the model in order to keep with its continuity. The strap itself is a nylon strap, and it's this olive green type webbing. The best color to replicate this is using, well, Tamiya olive green. For the jerry can, I went with a dark shade of olive drab. Keep in mind, this is a metal jerry can, and this is the color they are generally found. On the gas cap itself, you can see the weathering that was added, which is just a little bit of gloss black with some more gloss varnish, or I should say gloss lacquer on it, just to give it that little bit of sheen, which is something that you will see on jerry cans that have been used very frequently. And the side details go on without any problems. First, there are a little bit of seam work that the builder is going to have to contend with just with the way the vehicle is designed. Like I touched upon before, the upper and lower hulls are 2 separate halves that glue together, and you will have a seam that runs along these 2 joining sections, as well as on the rear portion here where the rear hull makes contact with the upper hull and the roof. This was simply blended away with a little bit of red putty and also some super glue, and everything was polished away with the sandpaper, leaving it to the appearance that we have here. One thing about the bodywork that I want to mention is that with the way the areas need to be polished down, you will lose some indentation points for mounting on kit components. This is specifically true right here on the back where we have the 2 lift rings that are found on the rear portion of the hull. Because of their proximity to the seam, you will lose one of these indication points during the polishing procedure. However, if you are careful enough, you can leave one of the other indentations in place, and then this will allow you to mount the units where they need to go without any guesswork. However, if you have a situation where you accidentally polish them away, you're going to have to consult with some photographs of the real unit, do a number or 2 of calculations in order to figure out where these components go. So this is something you do have to pay attention to when you're working on one of these builds. One of these indication points that come to mind involve the side hatch that we have here. On the kit, there are these 2 molded in suggestion points for the mounting of external hinges. Well, on this variant here of the LAV-25, the external hinges are not present, so you're going to need to polish away those 2 little suggestion points. This was, again, easily done with some sandpaper, but you still have to be careful and to pay attention for it. Also, when it comes time to removing them, specifically on this hatch here, if you'll notice, there is this integrally molded in ridge found on the panel line. Well, obviously, if you're trying to sand away and eliminate those hinge points, you can easily remove the panel line for the hatch. This is something that's going to be a bit of a pain in order to replace in case you accidentally over sand it. So again, stay on the ball, pay attention, use some fine sandpaper, and you should be good to go. One last thing I want to mention before I depart from this section here involves the spare Stinger missile rack that we have on the side. This is a nice bit of detailing that's found on this kit, and it's one that if you paint it accordingly, it's going to give you a lot of detailing as opposed to leaving everything just overpainted with the base coat. In order to paint the tubes, I went with the following colors. First, the tubes themselves on the real unit would be fiberglass, and then they're painted with this dark olive drab coloring. The color on the model here, to replicate this, is Model Master Green Drab. Simply apply with a paintbrush, and then that was all that was needed to have been done. The end sections are where things get interesting. You see, the kit has all these pieces molded onto this plate here. And what's integrally molded on are the details, which are the tube themselves, which emerge from the wall, and then there's an end cap on top of it to protect the missile inside. The tube sections that emerge, I went ahead and painted them with the green drab, but you have to be really careful and you have to use a really fine paintbrush in order to prevent any sort of paint drips that could spread and go onto the areas where you don't want it. Finally, the end sections themselves, if you look carefully, you'll notice are a different color compared to the fiberglass tubes that I just touched upon. The caps themselves on the real unit, I believe, are plastic or some kind of a composite material. And on the real units, from what I've seen, they are this khaki type coloring. The color that I use is Tamiya Drab Khaki, I believe it's called. Anyway, if I'm mistaken, the XF number should be listed right here below on this portion of the video. These two were just applied with a small paintbrush, and once done, it gives you the completed look of the missile tubes that we have here. A similar procedure was also done on the Stinger missiles that are in the missile pods themselves. Moving to the opposite side of the model, nothing really much to talk about here. You can see the exhaust manifold. It goes together fairly easily. I also loved airbrushing that soot in this section here. It's just one of my favorite aspects of the LAV-25 family. But also on this version specifically, the AD, we have these 3 boxes here found on the side. The kit does have the suggestion points molded in exactly where these pieces go, and they just drop directly in place without any problems to be mentioned. Jumping up takes us to the turret, and the turret on the model here is basically assembled with the kit supply components. One thing I want to mention involves the interior, because I did something a little bit different on this build compared to the other 2 renditions that I touched upon before. On the other 2, the interior was painted with a Model Master light blue, while on this one here I went with the Tamiya color. I believe it's Tamiya Sky. The XF color that I use should be found right here listed below. The Tamiya color does a better job representing the interior color found on post-World War II American tanks. The Model Master Blue is still a good color, but the Tamiya one I feel is a little bit better. For the instrument panels themselves, unfortunately you're not going to be able to see them here with this glare, but they are painted with the same green drab that I use on the fiberglass tubes that I touched upon before. Of course, little knobs and switches are all painted in various colors from red to black, again, which is what would typically be seen on the real vehicle. Directly on the exterior, you can see some clear plastic sections. These are the same kit supplied units that I've mentioned before and went on without any problems. The units are detailed, and in order to make the units pop a little bit further, with a paintbrush, I just painted the little window trimming, as well as the windshield wipers that are found here on the front panes. From the windows, this takes us to the model's armament. The model, or I should say the stock Italeri kit, has this cool feature where the Vulcan Gun and the missile pod move up and down in unison. However, it's only on these 2 units here. This unit here is just meant to be glued permanently in place and doesn't move at all. This was the same mod that I touched upon in the other videos, where I went ahead and connected all 3 of these units together so that when you move one, all 3 of the systems move in unison. The way this is done is, first, with the way the kit's designed, you have this column that connects this missile pod to the center mounted gun. It then emerges into this portion here of the turret, but doesn't go all the way out to this side of the wall to connect to whatever equipment you have on the side. Remember, this kit has the option to either mount a missile pod here or another antenna base in that area. To modify the system, it's very easily done. First, on the column itself, I drill a 1/16 of an inch hole in the center of the axle. I then go ahead and drill a 1/16 of an inch hole on this side here of the turret. Remember, it is blocked off because the piece is just meant to be glued on permanently. Now that there's a hole there, however, there's a small section of rod that emerges from the turret, and this unit can then simply plug in place. However, you have to make a modification to the missile mount itself. You see, the missile mount is molded hollow, and it's basically a tube found on the opposite end here of this column. The tube is larger in diameter compared to 1/16 of an inch, so in order to get it to fit onto the shaft, I went ahead and glued a small piece of runner on the inside to fill up the hole, and then I just simply drilled out the center of the runner, giving you the point that this could slide onto the axle. Sounds complicated, but it's actually really quick and simple to do, and once done, you'll have the effect that I have here, where all 3 of the units can move up and down in unison. Moving from the missile pod takes to the Vulcan Gun. What you see here is built out of the box. It is nicely detailed, but it's a piece that has many sub-assemblies to it, and it's one that can be very easily damaged if someone doesn't have the experience with working with fine molded parts like these barrels and the barrel rings. While in this section here, you can see how the unit is weathered. We have the standard wear, which I typically add to my machine guns and other armament, but on the muzzle end here, you can see that there's a little bit of powder fouling going on, as well as also on the shell ejection port that we have here. On a similar note, you can see the soot buildup from the 2 Stinger missiles that launched out of both of those units. With the way the kit is designed, you have one of the missile pods that has been expended. A small little poof of exhaust soot was added to both the front as well as on the back. While on the rear portion of the turret, this takes us to one of the last mods that I made, and that involves the antenna base cluster that we have here. The kit does have plastic antennas that are integrally molded onto their spring antenna bases. However, like I frequently mention in these videos, this is something that is less than ideal and is generally problematic because of their frailness and fragility. Not to mention they're in a really snag-prone location. If one snapped, you're in trouble. So what I went ahead and did was my usual technique where I snip off the molded in wires. I drilled out the antenna bases with a small pin vise and a micro bit, and then I just fabricated new antenna wires out of fluoro wire. However, unlike the older World War II vehicles where the antenna wires themselves are painted black and they have their knurled tips represented, for post-World War II, or I should say within the last 30 years or so, they have the antennas in the following format. First, the springs are painted in NATO black, and the antenna wires themselves are NATO green. By the way, I want to give a shout out to one of my subs who mentioned this little fact in one of my older videos, and he was absolutely correct about that. However, this is something that's more or less a rule of thumb. It's not uncommon to find equipment like this, specifically in National Guard or Reserve units, that are older and haven't just been overpainted with the base color of the vehicle. I'm talking specifically about the spring antenna bases. But again, if you're building a post-70s era American World War II vehicle, be sure to paint those antenna bases with the NATO black color that I have here. Moving to the paint and the markings, this model here is painted in a very simplistic scheme, which is just overall NATO green. This is how the customer requested it, but it's also how these vehicles would have been seen in real life. The base coat is my own exterior latex coloring, but it's basically Tamiya NATO green. The remainder of the weathering is applied with my usual format of washes as well as dry brushing in order to get the look that you see here. For the vehicle's markings, the kit supplied water slide decals were utilized, and then the entire model was sealed off with VMS varnish. This is a departure compared to my last builds, which were done with the Model Master dull coat that I've touched upon before. And to compare and contrast, here we have the commission-built LAV-25, along with my LAV-25AD that was mentioned in the other video. You can see the two are built basically identical, but you can see that this one here was built with the other option to have the missile pod mounted on the center and the other antenna base mounted on the rear. Also, with the units side by side, you can see the differences between the use of Tamiya Sky as well as the Model Master Light Blue. And what the hell, since I have the other build on hand, I might as well include it with this nice little family portrait that we have here. Safe to say, I don't think this is the type of place where you want to be a MiG and or a Hind. Well, at the end of the day, I'm happy in how this build turned out, and I'm pretty sure so is the commissioner. The model goes together very easily and mostly effortlessly as a whole. However, this one did have that weird wonky snafu with the front transmission that I've of course touched upon before. Moving into skill level and recommendation, I'm going to go a little light on this because, well, it's basically redundant information from the last video. But to reiterate, this model here I can't really recommend to a beginner. This model here is best left for someone who's an intermediate to an advanced range. The reason why this model I feel is not beginner friendly is due to the complexity of some of the components found on the turret, namely the Stinger missile system, the Vulcan Gatling gun system, as well as also some of the clear parts that are found on this model. Because of these finely molded details, you can't really assemble one of these if you've never touched a plastic model kit before. So this is really something that you level up to after you've built a few models already under your belt. Another thing that I would also hazard against a beginner for is with the complexity of the suspension. Although the suspension parts are fairly easily assembled, you do have some finely molded bits here, which again can possibly cause some issues for someone who hasn't really built a model in a long time or who's never touched one before in their life. Moving to recommendations, obviously if you are a fan of the LAV-25 family of vehicles, this kit here is a must-have. The vehicle itself is also a very interesting rendition of the LAV-25, and it's one that is going to be a bit of an eye-catcher if in your collection. Because this kit can build into two different ways, I would recommend not only getting one of these models, but possibly the second, just so that you cover both bases and have both variations of this exact same model. There's another contender out there from Trumpeter. That one seems to be a later variant of this exact same pattern of vehicle, so if you get all three of them, you basically have the entire LAV-25AD family in the bag. Outside of the LAV-25 connoisseur, if you're the type of person that likes to build modern era military vehicles, this kit here is strongly recommended. If you're the type of person that, say, likes the Stryker, the BTR, the Abrams, the Bradley, basically any of the vehicles that have been developed within the last 30-something years, this model here would fit into your collection without any problems. On similar lines, if you're the type of person that digs wheeled military vehicles or armored cars, really, Dwight, honestly need to finish that sentence because this vehicle here will check all of those boxes. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/35th scale LAV-25AD. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been posted on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Catch you on the next one. Take care.